The sound of clinking glasses and low laughter filled the evening air inside the grand hotel restaurant. It was one of those places where every movement seemed rehearsed, where the waiters spoke softly and the guests sat with the calm confidence of people who owned more than they needed. The chandelier lights shimmered across the polished floor, and in the corner of the hall, a black grand piano added a touch of class to the atmosphere. Every evening, a skilled pianist played there. His music was gentle and controlled, the kind of sound that floated through the air without disturbing anyone's conversations. The guests liked it that way. The soft background tunes made their expensive meals feel even more elegant. Moving quietly between tables was a young waitress named Lena. She wore the same neat uniform every night, a white shirt, black vest, and a polite smile that she put on even when her feet ached. She worked longer hours than most, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. Her co-workers said she was dependable, the kind of person who never complained, no matter how hard the day got. But there was something different about her that no one noticed at first, the way her eyes drifted toward the piano every time she passed it. While others saw a fancy instrument meant to entertain guests, she saw something else. She saw a part of herself she had left behind. Years ago, before life got difficult, she had dreamed of being a pianist. Her mother used to tell her that she was born with music in her hands. As a little girl, she spent hours at an old upright piano that her family kept in their small apartment. It wasn't in perfect condition, but to her it was magic. She would play until her fingers hurt, losing herself in melodies she made up on her own. But life had a way of changing plans. When her father lost his job, everything started to fall apart. The piano was sold to pay rent, and lessons became a luxury they couldn't afford. Her mother started working extra shifts, and Lena took on small jobs to help with bills. Music slowly faded from her days, replaced by the sound of dishes, customers, and cash registers. Now, years later, she found herself serving food to people who didn't know her story. People who ordered expensive wine and never noticed the quiet girl who set it down in front of them. But every night when the pianist began to play, she would pause just for a second, pretending to adjust a tablecloth or fix a candle, only to listen. Sometimes she caught herself whispering the names of chords under her breath. Sometimes her fingers moved slightly in the air as if they were still on the keys. One of her co-workers, an older woman named Carla, noticed it once and teased her gently. "You stare at that piano like it's your boyfriend," she said, laughing as they cleaned up after hours. Lena smiled shyly and shook her head. "It's just a habit," she said. But deep down, it wasn't just a habit. It was a longing that never faded. On quiet nights, when the restaurant was nearly empty and the last customers lingered over dessert, she would sometimes imagine walking over to that piano, sitting down and letting her fingers do what they used to do best. But then she'd remember where she was, a waitress, not a musician, and the thought would fade before she even took a step. Still, she dreamed about it almost every night. Her life was simple and predictable. She lived in a small rented room near the hotel, shared with 2 other girls. Every morning she woke up before sunrise, made herself instant coffee, and hurried to catch the bus. She saved every bit of money she could, hoping to one day buy a small keyboard, just something to play at home again. But rent, bills, and small emergencies always came first. There were days when she wondered if she'd made a mistake by giving up music completely. But then she'd remind herself that dreams didn't pay for groceries. Responsibility did, and so she kept working day after day, smiling at strangers and wiping tables even when her heart felt heavy. One Friday night, the restaurant was busier than usual. A large private dinner was being held for a group of wealthy business guests. The tables were covered with white linens and fresh flowers stood in glass vases. The pianist was already playing when Lena arrived. His music was smooth and effortless, the kind of perfection she once practiced for hours to achieve. As she worked, she couldn't help but steal glances at his hands, steady, confident, graceful. A quiet ache stirred inside her. She remembered her own hands once moving that way, gliding across the keys with a kind of joy that words couldn't explain. She missed that feeling, the way music used to make her forget everything else. Later that night, after the guests left and the restaurant began to close, Lena was wiping the piano surface carefully. It was part of her duties, to make sure every corner of the dining hall looked spotless. The pianist had already gone home. She paused for a moment, her hand hovering over the keys. Her heart began to race. No one was around. The lights were dim and the silence felt soft and welcoming. She looked toward the door, making sure no one would walk in. Then before she could stop herself, she pressed one key, just one. The note rang out clear and warm. It felt like breathing again after being underwater for too long. Her fingers moved to another key and another. Before she realized it, she was playing a small melody she remembered from childhood. The sound filled the empty restaurant, and she closed her eyes. It was simple, but it carried so many emotions. Sadness, hope, longing. She played softly, afraid to be caught, yet unable to stop. Then she heard a voice behind her. "Didn't know you could play." She froze instantly. Turning around, she saw the manager standing a few feet away, arms crossed but not angry. He had come back to check something in the office and must have heard the music. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I didn't mean—" He raised a hand to stop her. "Relax," he said. "You play well." That was nice. Her face turned red. "It's been years," she murmured. "I just missed it." The manager nodded slowly as if he understood. Then he gave her a small smile. "Don't let anyone catch you next time," he said lightly before walking away. She stood there for a moment, heart pounding, half embarrassed and half thrilled. Even though she'd been caught, it felt worth it. For a few minutes, she'd felt alive again. After that night, she didn't touch the piano again, but the thought of playing stayed with her stronger than ever. Sometimes, while serving tables, she'd imagine herself performing on a stage. Lights dimmed, people listening closely, and then reality would pull her back, a tray to carry, an order to take. But the dream stayed alive in quiet corners of her mind. Weeks passed like that, with her routine unchanged. She was just another face in the hotel, polite, quiet, unnoticed. Yet something inside her was slowly shifting. Every night she heard the pianist play, she felt an invisible pull, like a whisper saying, "You still belong there." She didn't know it yet. But life was about to test that belief in a way she never expected. One afternoon, as she was polishing glasses behind the counter, she overheard two employees talking. The hotel had booked an important event for the following weekend, a private dinner for international guests, including several well-known figures. The pressure was on. Everything had to be perfect. The manager wanted no mistakes, no delays, and definitely no surprises. When the day finally came, the restaurant looked more elegant than ever. Expensive suits, glittering jewelry, soft laughter. Everything about the night screamed importance. The pianist had been instructed to play nonstop until the speeches began. Lena worked harder than usual, barely taking a breath between tables. It was one of those nights where every second mattered. She didn't even look toward the piano at first. But when she finally did, she noticed something strange. The pianist seemed uncomfortable. He was sweating and fidgeting slightly, his usual confidence missing. Between songs, he rubbed his chest and coughed quietly. A few minutes later, during a pause, he leaned over to the manager and whispered something. The manager's face changed immediately, a look of panic. The pianist stood up, clearly unwell. The music stopped. Guests turned their heads, murmuring softly. The manager rushed to his side, helping him off the stage. For the first time all night, the restaurant was silent. The absence of music made everything feel awkward. Lena froze where she stood, watching the scene unfold. The manager looked around desperately, as if hoping a replacement pianist would appear out of nowhere. One of the guests even joked, "Maybe someone else can play." And that's when it happened. A small voice inside her whispered again, "You can." Her heart pounded in her chest. It was an impossible thought, but it wouldn't go away. She looked at the piano, the same one she had touched only once when no one was watching. Her hands trembled at the idea. Before she knew what she was doing, she took a small step forward, then another. She walked up to the manager and spoke softly, almost afraid of her own words. "I can play," she said. He turned toward her, confused. "What?" "I can play the piano," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. The guests nearby heard her and a few chuckled, thinking it was a joke. A waitress? Playing the grand piano? It sounded ridiculous, but the manager didn't have many choices. He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right," he said, "if you're sure." And just like that, Lena found herself walking toward the piano. Her steps felt heavy, her palms sweaty. She could feel the stares of the elite audience behind her, people who had no idea who she was. Her heart raced faster than ever. When she sat down, her reflection shimmered on the piano's glossy surface. For a second, she almost stood up again, ready to run, but something deeper kept her there. The same quiet longing she'd carried for years. She placed her hands on the keys and took a deep breath. The restaurant was silent, waiting. No one knew that the moment she played her first note, everything in her life would change forever. When she sat at the piano, everything around her felt unreal. The murmur of voices faded into a distant hum. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes fixed on her back. Her uniform still smelled faintly of coffee and cleaning polish, and the black vest she wore suddenly felt too tight. Her heart pounded so loudly she thought the audience might hear it. For a few seconds, she didn't move. The polished keys shone under the soft light, and her fingers hovered above them, unsure where to begin. The manager stood near the corner, watching nervously. The guests waited with mixed expressions, some curious, others amused. A few people whispered things she could almost make out. "Is this a joke?" someone said quietly. Another voice laughed under its breath. "She's a waitress, not a musician." Lena's throat tightened. Every word reached her like a small cut, but she couldn't back away now. The empty piano in front of her looked both terrifying and comforting at the same time. It was the thing she loved most in the world, and also the thing she'd been afraid to face again. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the keys. For a moment, she thought about the songs she used to play years ago, simple, emotional tunes that came straight from her heart. She remembered sitting beside her mother at that old, squeaky, upright piano they once owned. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, soft and steady. "Don't play for perfection, play for feeling." And that was exactly what she decided to do. Her fingers pressed down, releasing the first note. It was a single sound, gentle, clear, almost like a whisper. The entire room fell silent. Even the waiters froze mid-step. Then she began to play. It wasn't a well-known song. It was one of her own. Something she had written when she was younger, when life still felt full of promise. The melody began softly, then rose slowly like a wave. Each note carried pieces of her life. Childhood laughter, the sadness of lost dreams, the quiet strength she had built from years of struggle. At first she was nervous, afraid her hands might slip. But as the music filled the air, something shifted. Her fear melted away, replaced by a calm she hadn't felt in years. Her fingers started to move on their own, guided by instinct and memory. The piano became an extension of her soul, and she forgot where she was. The guests listened in stunned silence. Some had lowered their wine glasses without realizing it. The sound wasn't like the careful, practiced pieces they were used to hearing. It was raw, emotional, and real. There was something about the way she played, gentle yet powerful, fragile yet brave, that made people stop and listen with their hearts instead of their ears. Even the manager, who had been holding his breath in worry, relaxed slightly as he watched her. He had never seen her like this before. The quiet, polite girl who cleaned tables now sat glowing in the spotlight, transformed completely. As she played, memories flashed through her mind. The night she stood by this same piano pretending to wipe the surface while secretly tracing invisible notes. The sound of her father telling her they couldn't afford lessons anymore. The sting of dreams she had pushed away for survival. All of it poured into her music. She didn't try to impress anyone. She just let it all out. When she reached the middle of the song, the melody turned softer, almost like a sigh. Her head tilted slightly, her eyes closed. A few guests exchanged glances. Someone in the front row blinked rapidly, fighting the emotion the music stirred. It was strange, how a simple tune could carry so much pain and beauty all at once. Then, as the final notes approached, she slowed down. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the emotion of it all. She held the last note longer than expected. It echoed through the hall like a breath that refused to fade. When it finally ended, the silence that followed was heavy. For a few seconds, nobody moved or spoke. The sound seemed to hang in the air, unwilling to leave. Then came a single clap, from one of the guests in the middle. It was hesitant at first. Then another joined in, and another, until the entire room erupted into applause. Lena's eyes opened, startled. She blinked as if waking from a dream. People were standing now, cheering and clapping louder than she'd ever imagined. A few guests even whistled in excitement. Her heart raced again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was disbelief. She stood up slowly, her hands still shaking, unsure of what to do. The manager approached, smiling in a way she'd never seen before. "That was incredible," he said softly. "I had no idea." She tried to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes filled with tears. All she could manage was a small, grateful nod. Some guests came over to her after the applause faded, still amazed. One older woman, elegantly dressed, said, "You play with such emotion, dear. I haven't heard anything that pure in years." Lena blushed and whispered a quiet thank you. She didn't know how to respond to so much attention. Others wanted to know her story. "Where did you train?" one man asked. "Do you perform anywhere else?" Another chimed in. She shook her head shyly. "No, I just used to play when I was younger," she said. They were surprised. To them, her playing sounded professional, even masterful. But she didn't think of herself that way. To her, it wasn't about skill. It was about feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time. That night, after everyone left and the restaurant grew quiet again, she stayed behind to clean as usual. The piano still stood there, its surface reflecting the warm lights. She paused beside it for a moment, running her fingers gently along the edge. The manager came by as she was putting away the last of the glasses. "You know," he said, leaning against the counter, "you saved the night." "They loved you," she smiled faintly. "I was just lucky," he shook his head. "No, you were brave. There's a difference." For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to feel proud. When she finally got home, the city streets were quiet. She walked slowly, the cool air brushing against her skin. She couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head. The first note, the faces in the crowd, the applause. It all felt unreal, like something from a movie. In her small room, she sat by the window for a long time, unable to sleep. Her hands still tingled as if the piano's warmth hadn't faded. She smiled to herself, whispering, "I did it." The next morning, things were different. As soon as she arrived at work, people began talking. The story had already spread among the hotel staff. Someone had recorded a short clip of her performance on their phone and shared it online. By lunchtime, guests and employees were showing each other the video. "That's her," someone said, pointing at Lena. "The waitress who played like a professional." She didn't know whether to be embarrassed or happy. Part of her wanted to hide. Another part wanted to smile. The manager looked proud but also amused by all the attention. "You've gone viral," he joked as he passed her. "Better not forget us when you're famous." She laughed nervously, not really believing it would go anywhere. But by evening, her phone began buzzing nonstop. Messages from coworkers, old friends, even strangers. People were tagging her in the video, leaving comments like, "This gave me chills," and "She plays with her soul." Her hands trembled as she scrolled through them. She had never seen her name next to so many kind words before. Still, she tried to stay grounded. She went back to work the next day like nothing had changed. But deep inside, something had. She walked a little taller. She smiled more easily. And every time she passed the piano, the staff would nudge her playfully, whispering, "That's our star." A few days later, the manager called her into his office. He looked serious but kind. "We've been getting calls," he said. "People asking if you'll play again." Her eyes widened. "Play? Here?" He nodded. "Yes, guests are requesting it. They want the Waitress pianist. I was thinking maybe you could perform a short piece during dinner once or twice a week." "Officially, I mean." Lena stared at him in disbelief. "You mean me? On purpose?" He smiled. "Yes, you. On purpose." It took her a few seconds to respond. Then she nodded slowly, a small smile spreading across her face. "I'd love to." And that's how her second chance began. The following weekend, she played again, not out of panic this time, but because she was invited to. The restaurant filled with people who had seen the viral clip and wanted to witness it in person. She wore the same uniform, but now there was something different in her eyes. Confidence. When she played, she wasn't the shy waitress anymore. She was simply herself. And once again, the crowd fell silent. After her set, people clapped not out of surprise this time, but out of admiration. She bowed slightly, her heart full. Later that night, when the restaurant emptied, she stayed by the piano, pressing a few soft notes just for herself. She didn't know what the future held, whether this was just a small moment of luck or the start of something bigger. But for now, she was content. She didn't need fame. She didn't need promises. She only needed the piano, the sound of her heart turned into music, and the reminder that dreams never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to be heard again. Outside, the city lights shimmered through the glass windows. She stood there for a long time, looking out, smiling quietly to herself. For years, she had served other people's tables while hiding her own light. But tonight, the world had seen it, and that, she thought, was enough. The days that followed were nothing short of a dream. Every evening, when she walked through the restaurant doors, people looked at her differently. Some smiled, others nodded with quiet admiration. The same guests who once passed by without noticing her now greeted her warmly, sometimes asking, "Will you be playing tonight?" She still wore her waitress uniform, but it didn't feel like a disguise anymore. It felt like part of her story, the reminder of where she started. Every weekend she was given a small window to perform. She would play for 15 minutes before dinner service, and each time, the room would fall silent. People would stop eating, stop talking, and just listen. The sound of her music seemed to change the mood of the whole place. Conversations became softer, smiles more genuine. Even the staff moved slower, more carefully, as if they didn't want to disturb the spell her music created. She never played complicated classical pieces. Instead, she played simple melodies, ones filled with emotion, the kind that came from the heart and touched people without them knowing why. She didn't read from sheets. She just closed her eyes and let her hands move where they wanted to go. It was honest music, and that honesty was what made it powerful. One night after her performance, a guest approached her. He was an older man with kind eyes and a calm voice. "You remind me of my daughter," he said softly. "She used to play like that, sung with feeling, not just with skill." "Don't ever lose that," she smiled shyly, not knowing what to say. Compliments still felt strange to her, but each one touched her deeply. What she didn't realize was that her performances were being recorded more often now. Guests filmed her on their phones, sharing her videos online. The clips spread quickly. Her story of being a waitress who played like a concert pianist fascinated people. Within days, views turned into millions. Comments flooded in from strangers all over the world. This brought me to tears. Her music feels like it's telling a story. You can hear her life in every note. She read some of the comments during her short breaks, her heart swelling with disbelief. She never imagined that something so simple could reach so many hearts. Soon, local news stations picked up the story. One morning, as she was setting tables before opening, the manager came over, grinning widely. "You're famous now," he said, holding up his phone to show her an article. The headline read, "Waitress's piano performance silences luxury crowd, internet falls in love." She laughed nervously. "I'm not famous," she said, shaking her head. But deep inside, she couldn't deny the small spark of joy that bloomed in her chest. Within a week, reporters began showing up at the restaurant. They wanted interviews, photos, anything about her. Some customers came just to see her in person. It was overwhelming, but she stayed humble, polite as always. She didn't see herself as a star. She was just someone who got lucky enough to play again. One evening, after a particularly emotional performance, a woman from a well-known TV show approached her. "We'd love to feature your story," the woman said, handing her a card. "You'd inspire so many people. You have something real, something people can feel." Lena hesitated. "I've never been on TV before," she said softly. "That's what makes it perfect," the woman replied with a warm smile. "People will love you because you're genuine." She took the card and kept it in her pocket, unsure what to do. That night, as she walked home under the streetlights, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She had dreamed of moments like this long ago. Not the fame, but the chance to share her music freely, to be heard. Still, part of her was scared. She wasn't used to attention. She'd spent years blending into the background, not standing out. The thought of cameras, interviews, and lights made her nervous. But another voice in her heart whispered that maybe this was her chance. The second chance life was finally offering. After talking with her manager, she agreed to do the show. When the day arrived, she sat in the makeup chair feeling completely out of place. The bright lights, microphones, and bustling crew made her dizzy. She had never worn so much makeup before. One of the assistants noticed her nervousness and said gently, "Just be yourself. That's all you need to do." She nodded and took a deep breath. When it was her turn, the host greeted her warmly. "You've touched millions of people with your piano playing," he said. "How does it feel to go from serving tables to inspiring the world?" She smiled shyly. "It feels strange," she admitted. I never thought people would notice. I was just doing what I loved. The audience clapped softly. They talked about her life and how she learned to play, how she stopped, and how she found her way back to the piano again. She spoke honestly, her voice quiet but sincere. She didn't dramatize anything. She simply told the truth about her family's struggles, about losing the piano, about working long hours just to survive. Then the host asked her to perform live. A piano had been set up on the stage. The sight of it calmed her. It didn't matter how big the cameras were or how many people were watching. The moment her hands touched the keys, the world around her disappeared. She played the same melody she had played that first night in the restaurant. By the time she finished, the audience was silent, just like before. Then the applause came, strong and heartfelt. That performance changed everything. Within days, offers started coming in. Music producers reached out. Charity organizations invited her to perform, and schools asked her to speak to students about not giving up on their dreams. It was more attention than she had ever imagined, but she remained grounded. She still worked her shifts at the restaurant for a while, refusing to quit until she was sure she could stand on her own. The manager was proud of her. "You've earned this," he told her one night after closing. "You're proof that talent never disappears, it just waits for the right moment." Those words stayed with her. As weeks passed, she found herself performing more often, not just in the restaurant but at small community events and local gatherings. Every time she played, she could see the same reaction. People smiling through tears, hearts softening, conversations stopping. Her music wasn't about showing skill. It was about sharing feeling. But with all the joy came pressure too. The more popular she became, the more people expected from her. They wanted perfection every time. Critics began to appear online, comparing her to professional pianists. Some questioned if her story was real. Others said she was just a lucky viral star who would fade away. Those comments hurt. She tried to ignore them, but late at night they echoed in her mind. Doubt crept back in. The same old fear that she wasn't good enough. One night, after a particularly stressful performance where she missed a few notes, she went home and cried quietly. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had once made people fall silent, and whispered, "Maybe I'm not meant for this world after all." But then she remembered the faces of people she had moved with her music. The older man who said she reminded him of his daughter, the manager who believed in her, the countless strangers who said her music gave them hope. She couldn't let fear take that away. The next morning, she sat at a small keyboard she had finally bought for herself and began to play again just for her. No audience, no cameras, no pressure. Only her and the music. And as she played, she remembered why she started. Not for fame, not for validation, but because it was the only way she knew how to speak her heart. From that day forward, she promised herself one thing. She would never let other people's opinions decide her worth again. She would keep playing no matter who listened, and that decision brought her peace. Weeks later, she was invited to perform at a charity gala. It was her biggest stage yet, a hall filled with influential guests, journalists, and musicians. The same type of people who had once looked down on her when she was just a waitress. As she stood backstage waiting for her cue, she felt the same nerves she'd felt that first night. But this time, instead of fear, she felt gratitude. She wasn't just the girl who served food anymore. She was the woman who dared to play when no one believed in her. When she walked on stage, the lights were blinding, but the piano stood there waiting like an old friend. She sat down, took a deep breath, and began to play. The melody was familiar, the same one that had started it all. But now it sounded fuller, richer, more alive. Every note carried her journey, from quiet longing to courage, from fear to freedom. By the time she reached the final note, the audience was silent again, just like that first night in the restaurant. Then came the applause, loud and powerful, echoing through the hall. She stood, bowed slowly, and smiled. For her, it wasn't about the fame, or the cameras, or the applause. It was about that one moment, when her music filled the air, and she felt truly seen for who she was. That night, as she walked off the stage, she thought about the girl who once stood behind tables serving others while secretly dreaming of this moment, and she whispered to herself, "You did it." The next morning, the hotel restaurant was busier than usual. The night before, something unforgettable had happened there, something no one could stop talking about. Guests, workers, even the manager himself kept repeating the same story to whoever would listen. The night the waitress sat at the piano, Lena didn't fully understand what she had started. She woke up that morning still replaying the sound of applause in her head. It felt like a dream she didn't want to end. For so many years she had worked in silence, serving others, keeping her dreams hidden. But now everything had changed. When she walked into the hotel that day, people looked at her differently. The chef smiled. The front desk clerk gave her a thumbs up. The manager, who usually walked by without much notice, stopped her and said, "You did something special last night." "You should be proud," she nodded shyly. "Thank you," she said, her voice still small. By the afternoon, a guest approached her during lunch service. "Are you the one who played last night?" the woman asked, holding her phone. "Was that really you?" Lena nodded, a little embarrassed. The woman showed her a video on her screen. "Someone recorded it. It's all over the internet. Look at the comments. People are calling you the piano waitress." Lena stared at the video. It showed her sitting at the piano, the lights glimmering softly on her face, her fingers trembling at first, then moving with confidence. The sound was raw, full of emotion. The video had already been shared thousands of times. By the next morning, it had crossed 1 million views. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. She had messages from people she hadn't spoken to in years. Friends from school, neighbors, even her old piano teacher. One message read, "You never lost your gift." The world finally heard it. When she came to work again, reporters were waiting outside the restaurant. They had cameras and microphones. The manager looked nervous but also proud. He whispered, "They're here for you, Lena. Just be yourself." One of the reporters smiled and asked, "Is it true you were just a waitress before this performance?" She smiled softly. "I'm still a waitress," she said. "I just happened to sit at the piano." The clip aired on the local news that evening. They called it a moment of magic in the most unexpected place. People online wrote comments like, "Her music feels alive, and you can hear her story in every note." But fame, as she soon learned, was not always gentle. Within a week, she was invited to appear on a talk show. It was her first time being on TV. The host greeted her warmly, calling her story a reminder that talent can come from anywhere. She smiled nervously as the cameras turned toward her. "Tell us, Lena," the host said. "How did you feel when you first sat down at that piano?" She took a breath. "I was terrified," she said honestly. "I thought everyone would laugh. But once I played the first note, I stopped hearing the room. It was just me and the music again." The audience clapped. Some even stood up. After the show aired, invitations began to pour in. Music schools wanted her to perform. Hotels wanted her to be their featured pianist, and local events wanted her as a guest. It was overwhelming. She was still living in her small apartment, still working shifts, still trying to make rent. But suddenly her world was filled with choices she'd never imagined having. One afternoon, she sat with her old piano teacher, who had reached out after seeing her video. They met in a small cafe. The woman smiled kindly and said, "You know, when you stopped lessons years ago, I always believed you'd come back to the piano one day. I just didn't know it would happen like this." Lena looked down at her hands. "I thought it was too late for me." Her teacher shook her head. "It's never too late to return to what you love. The world is full of people who gave up just one step before success. You didn't." That evening, Lena went back to the hotel piano long after her shift had ended. She sat down quietly, pressing a few soft notes. The sound filled the empty hall. The place where she once served drinks now felt like a place that belonged to her heart. Over the next few weeks, she began performing officially for guests. The hotel put up a sign, "Live Piano Performance by Lena." She wore a simple dress, tied her hair neatly, and played with the same emotion that had once silenced an entire room. People stopped eating when she played. Some even cried, but fame can change how people see you and how you see yourself. The same co-workers who once joked with her now acted differently. Some were supportive, while others whispered behind her back. "She thinks she's a star now," one said. She heard it once while walking past the kitchen, and it stung deeply. She hadn't changed, but the world around her had. At the same time, big companies began to notice her online presence. A producer from a major music label contacted her saying, "You could be the next big thing. We can make an album, we just need to shape your image a bit." When she asked what that meant, he replied, "We'll add some modern beats, maybe a duet with a pop artist." People love emotional stories, but they love catchy songs more. Lena smiled politely, but her heart sank. The piano was never about money or fame for her. It was about expression, about the part of her soul that words couldn't reach. She wanted people to feel something genuine, not something manufactured. Still, the offers kept coming. Every choice seemed harder than the last. Her mother called one night saying, "You've made us all so proud. Don't let anyone change who you are." Those words stayed with her. Then came an invitation to perform at a charity gala, a huge event attended by well-known musicians and business figures. It would be her biggest performance yet, broadcast live on television. She practiced for days, sometimes forgetting to eat. The pressure was enormous. People were expecting perfection now, not just emotion. She could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on her every time she touched the keys. On the night of the event, the stage lights felt blinding. The audience stretched endlessly before her. Cameras flashed. As she placed her hands on the piano, she could hear her heartbeat louder than the crowd. When she played the first few notes, something strange happened. Her hands began to tremble. The memory of that first night at the restaurant flashed in her mind. How natural it had felt then, how free. Now it felt heavy, rehearsed, almost like a performance instead of a conversation with her soul. Halfway through the piece, she stopped. The audience gasped. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes and whispered softly, "No, this isn't right." Then she began again, not following the sheet music, but letting her fingers move on their own. The melody that emerged was simple, honest, full of life. Every note told her story again, from struggle to hope, from pain to peace. When the last note faded, the hall fell into the same silence she remembered from that first night. Then came applause, slow at first, then rising until the entire room stood. After the show, a journalist asked her, "Why did you change the song mid-performance?" She smiled and said, "Because music isn't about being perfect. It's about being real." The clip went viral again, but this time it wasn't about her being a waitress. It was about her being an artist who stayed true to herself. People admired her bravery. Some called it the most authentic performance they'd ever seen. The next morning, she returned to the same little cafe she used to visit before work. She ordered tea and sat quietly by the window, watching people pass by. For the first time, she didn't feel invisible. But more importantly, she didn't feel lost. Later that day, she went back to the hotel. The piano was still there, the same one where her story began. The manager greeted her with a proud smile. "You've come a long way," he said. She smiled back. "Thanks for believing in me when no one else did." He shook his head. "You made us all believe." That night she played again, not for fame, not for the cameras, but for herself. The room was filled with quiet warmth. Some guests recognized her and whispered excitedly, but she didn't pay attention. She just played, letting her heart speak the language it knew best. When she finished, an older man came up to her and said, "I haven't felt that kind of peace in years." "Thank you." She smiled gently and replied, "That's why I play." Fame would come and go. Offers would rise and fade. But music, the kind that came from her soul, would always stay. And that night, as the last guest left and the lights dimmed, Lena sat alone at the piano, running her fingers lightly across the keys. The sound was soft, almost like a whisper, as if the piano itself was saying, "You finally came home." She closed her eyes and smiled. In that quiet space, she didn't feel like a waitress or a celebrity. She just felt like herself, someone who had once dared to believe that one note could change everything. After her performance at the charity gala, Lena's life changed again. Her name began appearing in newspapers and on TV shows. People called her the waitress who played her heart to the world. She received so many invitations she couldn't even read them all. But along with attention came expectations, heavy ones that slowly began to press down on her in ways she hadn't felt before. Every time she sat at a piano now, she could almost hear the voices in her head. The producers telling her to be more commercial. The critics wondering if she could really handle fame. The journalists asking whether her story was just luck. The comments online, some kind, others not. It was as if the peaceful sound of her music had been buried under noise. At first, she tried to ignore it. She told herself, "Just keep playing from your heart." But the truth was, fame had its own rhythm, and it wasn't one she could easily follow. She was invited to perform in a famous concert hall for the first time, a place where world-class musicians played. It was the kind of stage she had only ever dreamed of. The manager of the hall personally called her and said, "Your story has touched so many people. We would be honored to have you perform here." She agreed, but deep down she felt a quiet fear growing inside her. This wasn't like the restaurant where she played softly while people ate. This was a grand stage, bright lights and thousands of eyes waiting to see if she was as good as the story said. In the days leading up to the concert, she practiced every morning and every night. She barely slept. She went over every note again and again until her fingers ached. But the more she practiced, the less alive the music felt. It began to sound mechanical, lifeless, as if she was trying too hard to be perfect. One afternoon, her old manager from the restaurant called her. "How are you doing?" he asked gently. She smiled tiredly. "I'm fine, just preparing for the big concert." He paused for a moment before saying, "Don't forget how it all started, Lena. You didn't play to impress anyone back then. You played because you needed to. Don't lose that feeling." Those words stayed in her mind, but when she tried to relax, the pressure would return. Every magazine headline, every comment online reminded her that the world was watching. The night of the concert came faster than she expected. As she stood backstage, she could feel her hands trembling. The sound of the audience murmuring filled her ears like waves crashing in her chest. Her assistant whispered, "It's your turn." She took a deep breath and stepped onto the stage. The lights were blinding. The applause was loud. She bowed gently and sat at the grand piano in the center of the stage. Her fingers hovered over the keys, but her mind was blank. When she started to play, the notes came out clean, technically perfect. But something was missing. It didn't feel alive. She could sense it too, and panic began to rise in her chest. The more she tried to control it, the worse it got. Her hands stiffened. Her breathing quickened. And suddenly, in the middle of her performance, she stopped. The entire hall went silent. For a few seconds, she just sat there frozen. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone could hear it. The audience shifted uneasily, not sure what was happening. She whispered softly to herself, "No, this isn't who I am." Then she closed her eyes. She thought back to that first night in the restaurant, how scared she had been, how pure the moment felt when she played for the first time after years of silence. That night she hadn't cared who was watching. She just played for the sake of playing. A tear slid down her cheek as she placed her hands back on the piano. This time, she didn't follow the sheet music. She just let her fingers move freely. She played the melody she had written years ago, the one she had played as a child, the one she used to hum when life felt too heavy. The music flowed naturally, full of emotion, fragile and strong at the same time. The hall was completely still. Every note seemed to tell her story, of struggle, hope, pain, and love. When the last sound faded into silence, the room remained frozen for a moment. Then slowly people began to stand. The applause grew louder, rising like a wave until the hall was filled with sound again. Not just applause, but admiration, respect, even tears. After the concert, people rushed backstage to meet her. Reporters, musicians, and even strangers came forward, telling her how much her music had touched them. One woman with tears in her eyes said, "You reminded me why I loved music as a child." "Thank you." Lena smiled, exhausted but peaceful. For the first time in weeks, she felt like herself again. That night, when she returned home, she sat by the window and looked out at the quiet city lights. She thought about how easy it was to lose yourself when the world starts watching. She promised herself she would never forget where her music truly came from. Her heart, not her fame. But life wasn't done testing her yet. As her popularity grew, she received invitations to travel abroad, to perform in Paris, London, and Tokyo. Her schedule became packed. She barely had time to rest, let alone visit her family or see her old friends. Some days she woke up not knowing what city she was in. Everywhere she went, people greeted her with admiration. But fame began to feel lonely. The more people praised her, the less she felt seen for who she really was. One night after a long tour, she was sitting alone in her hotel room. The piano stood quietly in the corner. She tried to play, but her fingers felt heavy. She realized she hadn't played for herself in months, only for others. She closed her eyes and whispered, "What am I doing all this for?" Her phone buzzed with messages. Her manager reminding her of interviews, producers asking about her next album. She turned the phone face down. For the first time, she wanted silence. The next morning, she called her mother. "Are you okay?" Her mother asked gently. "I'm tired," Lena said softly. "I thought this would make me happy." There was a pause on the other end before her mother replied, "You were happiest when you played that piano at the restaurant. Maybe happiness isn't about being seen. Maybe it's about feeling something real." Those words hit her deeply. A week later, she canceled her upcoming shows. Her team was shocked. Some said she was making a mistake, that her career might fade if she disappeared now. But she didn't care. She needed time to breathe again, to remember who she was before the world discovered her. She returned to her hometown quietly without any announcements. When she walked into the same restaurant where it had all begun, everything looked smaller but warmer. The staff greeted her with joy. Some were new, some old, but everyone knew who she was. The manager smiled wide. "You're back," he said. She nodded. "Just for a while. I needed to come home." That evening, she sat down at the same piano where her journey began. It was a little worn out now, some of the keys slightly out of tune, but it still felt familiar, like an old friend. As she played softly, the few guests in the room turned to listen. There were no cameras, no spotlights, no applause waiting at the end. Just quiet faces and warm hearts. When she finished, an older woman came up to her and said, "You played beautifully. I could feel every note." Lena smiled, the same gentle smile she had that first night. "Thank you," she whispered. For the next few weeks, she stayed in town helping her family, teaching music to children and visiting her old piano teacher. Every time she sat with a student, she saw a reflection of herself, someone unsure but full of potential. She told them, "Don't play to impress anyone. Play to express what words can't say." Slowly, she began to write new pieces again, music that came from her heart, inspired by her own journey. These weren't made for fame or fortune. They were simple, honest, and deeply human. Months later, she received another call from the concert hall, this time asking her to perform again. She hesitated at first, but then agreed. Only this time she promised herself she would walk on that stage not as a celebrity, but as the same girl who once dared to sit at a piano when no one believed in her. On the night of the performance, as she played her new song, a piece she called Home, people in the audience cried quietly. It wasn't because of how perfect the music was, but because of how sincere it felt. When the final note faded, she bowed her head and smiled. She didn't need anyone's approval anymore. She had found peace again. That night, when she returned to her room, she sat by the window, listening to the city hum below. She whispered softly, "I found my sound again," and for the first time in a long while, she fell asleep with a calm heart, knowing that no matter where life took her, she would always return to the same truth. The music that comes from within will always reach the world more deeply than any fame ever could. Months passed since the night. Lena played her song Home on the grand stage. Life had finally slowed down to a peaceful rhythm. The rush of fame had faded into something calmer, more grounded. She wasn't chasing the spotlight anymore, and strangely, that made her happier than ever. Every morning she would wake early, open her small window, and let the sunlight spill across her piano keys. The room was quiet except for the sound of birds and the soft hum of city life outside. Sometimes she would just sit there with a cup of tea, her fingers resting lightly on the keys, not to perform or record, but simply to feel connected to something real. Her world had changed, but deep down she was still the same person, the girl who used to watch others play, who once dreamed of touching the piano in the restaurant she worked in. One day, she received a call from the manager of that same restaurant. His voice carried a tone of warmth and nostalgia. "Lena," he said, "we're renovating the place, but before we do, we're holding one last event here next week. Everyone wanted to know if you'd come. And maybe play one final time?" She smiled instantly. "Of course," she said. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The days leading up to the event felt like returning to an old story, one she had once lived but never fully closed. She visited the restaurant 2 days before the event to see the place again. The walls were freshly painted, but the memories were still the same. She could almost see her younger self hurrying between tables, balancing trays, sneaking glances at the piano every chance she got. The manager greeted her with a big smile. "It feels like yesterday, doesn't it?" "It really does," she said softly, running her hand over the piano lid. It was the same piano, a little scratched, a little worn, but still full of life. He laughed gently. "I still remember that night when you sat down and everyone thought you were joking." No one knew what was coming. She laughed too. Neither did I. When the night of the event arrived, the restaurant was full again. Old guests, staff members, and even a few people who had been there on that unforgettable night. Some brought their families, wanting to share the story of the night. A waitress silenced an elite crowd with her first note. The lights were dim, and the atmosphere felt warm and familiar. There were no fancy cameras or reporters this time, just real people waiting to hear her play again. Lena took a seat near the piano, chatting with a few guests. Many came up to thank her personally. One woman said, "My daughter started piano lessons after seeing your video years ago. She said you made her believe anyone could play if they truly loved it." Lena smiled kindly. "Tell her I'm proud of her. That's what music is for, to pass something on." When the time came for her to perform, the manager took the microphone briefly. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice slightly shaky with emotion. "Years ago, something magical happened right here in this room. Tonight, before we close this chapter, we get to experience it once more. Please welcome back, Lena." The applause was warm and genuine. As she walked to the piano, she felt a lump form in her throat. She sat down slowly, letting her hands rest on the same keys that had changed her life. For a moment, she didn't play. She just looked around the room, taking it all in. The faces, the lights, the soft laughter, the smell of food from the kitchen, everything that once made this place her second home. Then she smiled and whispered quietly, "This one's for all of you, and for that girl who used to dream from the corner." The first note echoed softly. It was the same melody she had played years ago, but this time it felt different. It carried the weight of her journey, the fear, the courage, the hope, and the peace she had finally found. The sound filled the room with something words could never express. It wasn't just music. It was memory turned into sound. The audience sat still, eyes closed, hearts open. Some smiled. Some wiped tears quietly as she played. She thought about all that had happened since that first night. The fear she'd felt when no one believed in her. The moment her hands touched the keys. The silence that followed, the storm of fame that came after. All of it now felt like one long piece of music with highs and lows. Quiet parts and loud ones, but somehow it all fit together perfectly. When the last note faded, the room was silent again. It wasn't an awkward silence, and it was full, deep, emotional. Then came the applause, soft at first, then stronger, until the room was filled with clapping, laughter, and a few people even standing. The manager came forward, his eyes misty. "You did it again," he said quietly. "You made everyone feel something real." Lena smiled. "That's all I ever wanted." After the performance, she stayed back for a while, talking with guests and staff. Many shared small memories, how she used to hum while serving, how kind she was to everyone. Someone said, "You were always meant to be behind that piano." Later that night, after everyone left and the lights were dimmed, Lena asked the manager if she could have a few minutes alone with the piano. He nodded, understanding immediately. She sat down again, running her fingers lightly across the keys. The soft notes echoed through the empty restaurant. It felt like she was having a quiet conversation with her past, with the girl who once dreamed silently, who dared to take a seat when no one thought she should. She whispered softly, "Thank you for not giving up, even when it felt impossible." Outside, the city was quiet. The world had moved on, but inside that room, time stood still. She thought about everything music had given her, not just fame or applause, but lessons about courage, patience, and staying true to herself. She realized that the piano had always been her voice, even when she couldn't speak. It had been her friend, her mirror, and her teacher. As she closed the piano lid gently, she smiled and whispered, "I didn't change my life. I just finally played the song I was meant to play." The next morning, she packed her things and left the city for a short trip to the countryside. She wanted to take a break, to reconnect with herself and nature. She found a small cottage near a lake, quiet and surrounded by trees. There was an old upright piano inside, slightly out of tune but full of character. Each morning she would sit by the window, watching the sunrise as she played soft melodies. Birds would perch near the window, listening, as if they too understood her music. Sometimes children from the nearby village would come to listen. She would smile and let them press the keys, teaching them simple tunes. "See," she would say gently, "you don't need to be perfect. Just feel the sound." One afternoon, a little boy asked her, "Miss, are you famous?" She laughed softly. "Maybe once, but now I'm just happy." That evening she wrote a new piece. A quiet, tender melody that spoke of beginnings and endings, of courage and peace. She named it The First Note, because that was where everything had truly started. Weeks later, she was invited to perform again, this time at a community center that raised funds for young musicians who couldn't afford instruments. She accepted without hesitation. She played the first note there, telling the audience, "Every dream begins small like a whisper. Sometimes you just have to be brave enough to listen to it." The crowd gave her a standing ovation, but more than the applause, what touched her most was the sight of the children clapping with bright eyes full of the same kind of dreams she once had. After the concert, she sat outside under the stars, the cool wind brushing against her face. The lake nearby reflected the moonlight and the world felt still again. She closed her eyes and thought of her father, who had once told her that music could heal people in ways words never could. He had been right. The piano had not only healed her life, it had connected her to countless others. Every note she played had carried a piece of her story. And somehow, those pieces had found their way into other hearts too. Years later, people would still tell the story of the waitress who sat at the piano and silenced the room with her first note. But to Lena, it was never about the silence or the applause. It was about that moment when she found the courage to play again after years of doubt. And that courage became her greatest song.